In this video, I'm going to be talking about classical conditioning. And the most famous study is Pavlov's study involving dogs. And so Pavlov was actually not a psychologist. He was trying to study salivation in dogs, and so he attached test tubes to their cheeks so he could measure how much they salivated. He collected their spit. The problem was that the dogs are moving around, so he'd strap them down into this machine and then he'd give them food, measure the spit. And he realized that the dogs were starting to salivate not just when they got the yummy food in front of them, but when they saw the people that were bringing the food, or they heard the sound of the door opening before the food came in, that these precursors were causing the dogs to salivate. And he decided that they were salivating because their bodies knew that they were about to get food, and that food would make them salivate, so their bodies were like, hey, let's just get the party started early. And that's really what classical conditioning is. So the definition you should know for classical conditioning is that it's a type of learning in which we learn to link two or more stimuli and anticipate events. So the dogs were linking the person coming into the room with them getting food, so they were anticipating the food by seeing the person getting started early. So there's an equation you need to know that we will talk about in connection to classical conditioning, and that is US leads to UR, NS plus US leads to UR, CS leads to CR. So we're going to break down what these abbreviations mean. So let's start with USUR. The US is unconditioned stimulus. Something is not conditioned. That means it is automatic, it's natural. So it is a stimulus that's unconditional, naturally and automatically occurring. So anything that is naturally automatically going to cause a response is going to be an unconditioned stimulus. There are a plethora of them in the world. So for example, if I put a yummy chocolate chip cookie in front of you, you would salivate. The cookie would be the stimulus. And so the reaction you get, that response, is called the unconditioned response. Actually, that should be conditioned. So the unconditioned response is an unlearned, naturally occurring response. So at this point, there's no classical conditioning. This is just life. This is when you hit your knee and your leg flies up. This is when someone claps in your face and you blink. This is when in class you get lemonade powder on your tongue and it makes you salivate. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to learn it. It just happens. So the next line of this, USUR, you see those here. Those are the same thing. This NS, that N stands for neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is exactly how it sounds. It's neutral. It's a stimulus that evokes no response. At least before conditioning. Anything that's random, irrelevant, there is not a universal natural response to it. So for example, if I say the word candy, there's no universal response to that. For dogs, if you ring a bell in front of a dog, there's not a universal response where every dog on earth is going to have a certain reaction to it. That would fall under this neutral category. So any random thing out there can be a neutral stimulus. So what happens is that you have this, I'll add some spaces here so we can break this up. So for Pavlov, what happened was the food made the dog salivate. So in the Pavlov example, the unconditioned stimulus was food, unconditioned response was salivation. You put yummy food in front of a dog, they don't have to learn, they're just going to salivate. So what Pavlov did was that after he figured out something was up here and he started screwing with it, he did lots of different versions of this. But in one, he rang a bell. Actually, I'll make this a different color. And then he gave the food, and the dogs would salivate. So he'd ring the bell, give the food, the dogs would salivate. At this moment, the first time he did this, it's still a random thing. The dogs were like, I don't know what that bell is, whatever. They didn't respond, but then he'd give the food, and the food would make them salivate. Now, the very first time that the sound of the bell alone caused the dogs to salivate, they made this connection. They had this link enough that they heard the bell and they said, oh, that means I'm about to get food. I'm going to salivate early. Then the bell becomes a conditioned stimulus. So eventually what's going to happen is that the sound of the bell alone is going to make the dog salivate. And the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus. So the next definition here. This is the originally irrelevant stimulus that, after association with the unconditioned stimulus, triggers a conditioned response. That's CR. So these are the same thing. CS and NS are the same thing. Bell, bell in this case. The difference in what you call it is, as long as you don't have a response specifically to the bell, it's considered a neutral stimulus. The first time the bell alone causes the dogs to salivate, now it's become a conditioned stimulus, and that response is now called a conditioned response. You'll see in these scenarios, these are also the same thing. So the final definition here, conditioned response, that CR, this is a learned response to a previously neutral stimulus. That is now the conditioned stimulus. So we will go over several examples in class of classical conditioning, but basically something random gets associated with something automatic, so the random thing also leads to a response. And this is going to be more for automatic behaviors. Reflexes are an awesome example of things that you can be conditioned for. So these are not voluntary as much as automatic. And that's it for classical conditioning at this point.